Okay, not long ago, I had posted this on Twitter saying that, the demonization of red meat has probably been one of the most harmful things that has ever been done. It has cost literally billions of people untold amounts of suffering. That advice has actually been horrible. And I want to just sort of solidify this point. I want to talk about some things, that we've looked at. For many years we've heard don't eat red meat. Red meat's bad for you, it causes heart disease. Oh my God, saturated fat, all this stuff on and on and on. I want to talk about, let's talk about the saturated fat. And so in 2020, there was an article in the Journal of American College of Cardiology talking about saturated fat and foods that contain them. They talked about nutrient-dense whole foods like meat, milk, eggs, chocolate, things like that contain a decent amount of saturated fat are not causative for heart disease. That's a study. There was another study that just came out last week looking at saturated fat. It was a large review article. It looked at meta-analysis of randomized control trials, cohort studies, observational studies, on and on and on. Again, the conclusion of that study was there's insufficient evidence whatsoever to implicate saturated fat as a causative agent in heart disease. There was a study called the PURE study, which is a large study looking at dozens of countries in Europe, and they found basically the same results. Higher amounts of fat in the diet, including saturated fat, was predictive of better health outcomes. There's a study out of Australia last year where they looked at countries with the highest amount of meat consumption, and they found the longest longevity rates. We know that, for instance, a country like Hong Kong, which has been traditionally eating the most meat of any, large population center, modern population center in the world, they have the highest life expectancy on Earth, and have for a number of years now. We've seen, like for instance, there are very few populations where meat is a primary food consumed. In the United States, where we are quote unquote heavy meat eaters, we only eat on an average a little over 2 ounces of beef per day, a mere 2 ounces. That's a tiny amount, quite honestly. I mean, I eat, 20 times that amount easily, and so that, looking at that data and trying to draw conclusions about saturated fat and meat causing disease it's just ridiculous. If you want to look at populations that have historically eaten lots of meat, we're left with some indigenous populations, Maasai, Inuit, Nene, Mongolians, and these people all routinely, number one, were not obese. We know they didn't suffer from obesity. And by and large, they avoided most chronic disease. There are people who say, well, the Inuit had some heart disease. Remember, the Inuit smoke at some of the highest smoking rates in the world. Their smoking rates are about 70%. They start smoking at about age 8, so maybe that confounding factor has something to do with it, perhaps. But here's more recent data that came out. It's looking at where is the saturated fat coming from in the American's diet. And what we see is only a tiny amount of the saturated fat that is consumed in the American diet is actually coming from red unprocessed meat, about 3%. Small amount is coming from steaks. Most of it is coming from junk food, pizza, pasta, pies, sandwiches, desserts, things like that. That's the vast majority of it. So perhaps you should say cut back on those types of foods, the processed foods, the desserts, things like that. And just because they happen to have saturated fat in them, maybe that's a confusion there. Anyway, continue to, like I said, eat more. This is a simple experiment to do. Cut back on all that other stuff, the junk food, all the pizzas, the pastas, the pies, the desserts that may have saturated fat on them or not. Just cut back on that stuff and dramatically increase your red meat consumption and see what happens. And for some of you that have already done that, put your comment in there. Tell us what happens. I can tell you what happens. When we're trying to assess the role that red meat or meat has on the diet, it does us very little good to use proxies like saturated fat, and then particularly when the majority of it's coming from junk food. That is just absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. Has increasing saturated fat by way of things like red meat been a net negative for your health or a net positive? My suspicion is it's probably been a net negative, but we'll see. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. We'll talk to you soon.